AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson joining you here on a Tuesday afternoon. And as usual on Tuesdays, it is time to have our visit with the Minnesota Reformer as we take a look at what they have been working on over at minnesotareformer.com, as they are a great resource for the latest in Minnesota news and politics. And joining us today to talk about what they're working on in the Reformer is Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. As today we have a few topics we're going to be talking about, including how Minnesota's insulin policy could be playing a role in the presidential race. We'll also be talking about a recent debate between Angie Craig and her Republican challenger Joe Tarab. Plus, we'll be talking about psychedelics. A fun conversation of that because we have some news on whether some of those could end up getting legalized in the near future here in Minnesota. So lots to get to. Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off in the political realm and talk about what happened between Joe Tarab and Angie Craig, who, of course, are the two candidates in Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District, which is widely expected to be the most competitive congressional race here in the state. In their second and final debate yesterday morning over in Lakeville, Angie Craig and her Republican challenger Joe Tarab clashed over public safety and police reform. In fact, Tarab, who is a former federal prosecutor, accused Craig of being swept up in the defund the police movement. Now, Craig pushed back against this as she's been endorsed by the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, and she pushed back by emphasizing her long-standing support for law enforcement. So let's talk about how Tarab attacked Angie Craig on this, Patrick, and how Craig responded, because as I am reading through, he mostly was doing this through Craig's support of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which in the grand scheme of things really was not much of a defund the police bill whatsoever back when that was proposed in the House.
Right. This is a very fragile thread that he bases this attack on. That bill, which passed the House, not passed the U.S. Senate, never became law, was crafted to try to get at least a few Republican votes and to pass. So it was by no means a defund police policy. It only would have put some restrictions on no-knock warrants and so-called chokeholds. And I mean, what's amazing about this is that if there was anyone in Democratic politics who was absolutely not swept up in the defund the police fervor, it was Angie Craig. I mean, she's built almost her entire political profile on the idea that she stands with police. As you mentioned, she's got the endorsement of the MPPOA. She was the first Democrat to come out against the Minneapolis ballot initiative in 2021 that would have reorganized the police department. And she caught a lot of criticism from Minneapolis Democrats in particular, who said, how dare you? You don't represent this district, and this issue doesn't affect you, and you're just doing this for politics. But as it happens, statewide Democrats then followed suit, including Tim Walz, Amy Klobuchar in particular, and said they were not supportive of that ballot initiative. But she was first, and she's continued to side with law enforcement for better or worse, depending on your politics. But so for some of us, she's been aligned far too closely with law enforcement. But the fact of that alliance with law enforcement is not really in dispute. Also worth noting that she, of course, is a victim of violent crime herself, when a man who is apparently disturbed attacked her in the elevator of her own apartment building in Washington, D.C., and she fended off that attack. So I'm not really, in politics, they always try to turn a weakness into a strength, a strength of your opponent into a weakness. And I think that's what he's trying to do here. And Tarab obviously has his own law enforcement credentials. But I just don't think that this attack is credible.
Yeah, especially when you look at Craig's record, as Michelle writes about in the article. Craig, of course, first gained the police group's endorsement back in 2022 because of her stand against the defund, or excuse me, the trying to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. But she's also introduced legislation that would make it easier for police departments to obtain military-style vehicles, and she does not support removing qualified immunity for police officers. So those are basically all stances that, yeah, very much fly in the face of the defund the police movement, and then let alone the fact that, as you said, last year she was attacked in that Washington, D.C. apartment building. So I guess you were kind of alluding to this, but I'm curious what T-Rob sees as an opening here in this race, because even though this is supposed to be one of the most competitive races in the country, I believe most prognosticators still have this very much in kind of the lean Democratic category. So at least on his end, is this possibly even like a last stand for the Republican Party here in CD2? Because, well, as I said, while it is close, they don't seem to be making a lot of waves nationally in terms of trying to flip this seat from Democrats to Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's got a good biography. He's the handpicked candidate of Representative Tom Emmer, who is in leadership of the U.S. House, and so I think they're able to raise a lot of money for him. But he's completely unknown, and that's a huge issue in a congressional race when you come in with 0% name recognition. Angie Craig has done a good job of positioning herself to really match that district. And she has a lot of experience running in close races. I mean, every single time she runs for re-election, it's been close. And she lost a race in 2016. So at this point, I think I would give her the advantage going into Election Day.
Well, you can read more about what Michelle wrote on that debate between T-Rob and Craig over at MinnesotaReformer.com. I want to move on and talk about something you wrote about in today's newsletter for the Minnesota Reformer, and that has to do with psychedelics, because this sounds like one fun task force to be part of. A lot of times people think, I don't want to be part of a government task force, but this one might be a little bit different, because the legislature recently created the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force, and they have been holding a number of meetings over the past while, and they have come up with some new recommendations according to a new report, and you were able to write about some of these, Patrick. So I'm curious, are we moving closer to having psychedelics legalized here in Minnesota? Because this whole task force seemed kind of interesting, being that even some Republicans on the task force seemed at least open to the idea of at least decriminalization. What recently happened with this task force?
Well, in 2023, the legislature created this task force, and I think that it had a little bit of Republican support. And so they've been meeting, and now they're getting close to filing their report with the legislature. There is an outline for the final report, and they've taken some votes. And I mean, I think it's an important step. We should note that these recommendations to the legislature are non-binding, so the legislature would actually have to act. But they have voted to remove criminal penalties for adult use and possession of personal amounts of psilocybin mushrooms, and have also recommended that money go to clinical research. And also that there would be a state-regulated program for clinical administration of natural psilocybin. So that's essentially money for research, and then also the beginnings of medicinal use. And so I think it's a ways to go before we have legal mushrooms here. And I should note that decriminalizing would be different than legalizing. Mm-hmm. In decriminalizing, you're just not going to sanction someone, whereas in legalizing, you probably set up some sort of regulatory regime, and there would be dispensaries and so forth. But again, I think it's a hopeful step for people who think that psychedelics have a future in psychological treatment. And I also just want to point out again. I mean, the guy who alerted me to this, Curtis Hanna, he's a Republican drug reformer, and he tells me that the two Republicans on the task force voted for the decriminalization recommendation. So I think that's important I don't think that this has a shot if Republicans take the state house. I think would be, you really would have to have a DFL trifecta here. But I think there's another. I'm also eager to see what the final report says about tribal sovereignty, because we're going to have tribal cannabis dispensaries, and so we'll have to see what they say about psilocybin dispensaries on tribal lands and so forth. But definitely a huge. I mean, if you had told me as a college kid in the 1990s that this would be the future, I would have been pretty skeptical. But there is momentum here.
Yeah, I most certainly would have been as well. And it sounds like you're pretty confident that it would pretty much need to be that DFL trifecta in order to get this passed and decriminalized. I was thinking maybe it could be a little more nonpartisan, being that we don't, have third parties that were siphoning votes from DFL candidates like we saw with the legalized cannabis candidates back a few years ago. And even though it does seem like there is some bipartisan support behind this, still the politics play a role, and it very likely would require a DFL trifecta. Other question I would have for you on this, kind of a two-part question, would be, at least in that, with the idea of tribal sovereignty, that would be the idea where they would at least be able to sell on their reservations until it would be fully legalized in the rest of Minnesota, similar to what we've seen with cannabis, correct?
Right. I mean, we don't know, what will be in the report, but that certainly seems like a possibility.
Well, you can read more about that over at minnesotareformer.com and follow along with that, because it's something that, as we kind of were alluding to, it's going to be in the news a little bit more, even though, as we were thinking like 20 or 30 years ago, this would have seemed absolutely insane had we been even having the conversation about psychedelics and mushrooms possibly being legalized in certain states in the U.S., let alone Minnesota. Final thing to ask you about, since I know we are running a little bit short on time, and I just briefly want to get your thoughts on this, because there was a good article in the Reformer today that talks about how Minnesota is figuring into presidential politics when it comes to the price of insulin. We, of course, had our own insulin bill passed in Minnesota a while back, which definitely made insulin more affordable for many Minnesotans. So I'm curious how this issue is working its way into the national presidential campaign, because as it sounds like Minnesota's law would go a lot further than even what both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are proposing when it comes to trying to make insulin even more affordable.
Right. Folks may remember that we had quite a debate over this in 2019 and 2020, and in April 2020, Wallace signed what was called the Alex Smith Insulin Affordability Act. It was named after Alex Smith, who died because he was rationing his insulin because he couldn't afford it. And so we passed a pretty strong bill here, and it did get some follow-up from in national politics. Where President Biden signed a law requiring that people on Medicare cap co-payments for insulin at $35 a month. Of course, that's just seniors. Most people you have to be on Medicare to get that deal. Now Harris, she wants to extend the $35 cap to all Americans, and so that's I think an impressive policy win for advocates of people with diabetes, and going from Minnesota, and looks like it could really take off nationally, which would provide a lot of relief to people who really need this medicine to survive, obviously.
You can read more about that over at minnesotareformer.com. Interesting read, again, how Minnesota's insulin law has kind of been making its way towards that national debate we're seeing, at least at the presidential level. Again, minnesotareformer.com. I've been speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Again, find more of what he and the rest of the great writers are writing about over at minnesotareformer.com. Patrick, as always, thanks for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.